Okay, everyone, this is going to be a quick follow-up to the democratic governance video. We can call it Democratic Governance Part 2. The other one was just getting quite long. I wanted to take a couple of minutes and just talk about systemic imperatives. We were talking last time about the central tension between democracy and freedom. I want to talk a little bit about the way in which these kind of built-in constraints that operate on decision makers within organizations kind of play out. That's what we mean when we talk about a systemic imperative. It's a kind of economic or social constraint that promotes kind of the status quo, the way things are at the moment. So it's a systemic imperative is something that basically creates the inertia in which a system continues to move along, seemingly impervious to change, even as people sort of recognize that it's dysfunctional or problematic or needs some kind of reform or addressing. So there are two types of systemic imperatives that operate in the context of U.S. government. The first is what we call the demand constraint, and the second is what we call the resource constraint. So I'll start with the demand constraint. Basically, this is a systemic imperative in which the general welfare gets subordinated to the welfare of capitalist firms. This used to be expressed quite succinctly with a saying that emerged in the 1950s and 1960s. What's good for GM is good for America. GM is General Motors, for those who don't know. So the idea is that what's good for business is good for everybody in society. And part of the reason for that, of course, is that we all work in, or most of us work in, capitalist firms. And so there's a sort of short-term incentive for us to support and subsidize the well-being of those firms, because it's through those firms that we derive a wage, and it's through a wage which we get access to housing and food and clothing and shelter and all that other stuff. So you can kind of see that right now in arguments for a more moderated approach to addressing the issues related to climate change, right? That this is a thing that's happening, but if we move too quickly, if we move too dramatically to address it, then it's going to be economically disruptive. What about all those poor coal miners? What about people who work in the fossil fuel industries? We can't shift over to a green energy-based economy because we're going to leave so many people out of work and unemployed. Or we can't move to Medicare for all because what about all the people who work in hospitals and doctors' offices? And what about all the people who work for the insurance companies? It'll be economically disruptive. So you can see that sort of concern being expressed all the time. And that concern, as it is expressed, is a reflection of what we call the demand constraint. And there are 6 steps to this argument. The first is that if the basic interests of these capitalist firms aren't sort of stably secured, then they're not going to be profitable. And that leads to the second point, which is that if the firms aren't profitable, then investors are going to either not invest or reduce their investments in these firms, which leads to the third step of the argument, which is that if investments decline, then production declines, which takes us to the fourth step of the argument, which is if production declines, then jobs and wages decline, which leads us to point 5, which is if jobs, income, and production decline, then the tax revenues that are available to the state are also going to decline, which leads to the last step of the argument, which is that if tax revenues to the state decline, then the capacity for the state to pursue its goals is going to decline. So again, the well-being of society is predicated on the well-being of General Motors or Disney or Amazon or Starbucks, or pick your capitalist firm. We can't change those firms even in ways that we all agree would be better, like a higher minimum wage, because the consequence is that in the end, it's going to cost all of us at every level. So we all have a stake in the well-being of corporate firms. So this is made necessary as a result of, obviously, capitalism, and it's going to remain so as long as the most important decisions are being made through the exercise of private power, as we talked about in the last video. You can see this kind of reflected. One of the many manifestations of this particular constraint began to show up in the 1980s in kind of a major way. I mean, it had been present for a while, but in the 1980s, it gets a kind of a shot in the arm with the emergence of what we call neoliberal economic policy. So liberal here, in the 21st century, for most people probably means Democrats. But liberal actually kind of traces in this sense. Liberal traces back to the Enlightenment philosophers and the notion of a social contract and the rights of people, and freedom, and letting people sort of act in their own interest, and everyone will flourish as a result. So when we talk about liberal in that sense, we're talking about sort of pro markets, pro freedom, limited government, right? Sort of the opposite of what we think of in a lot of regards today when we talk about liberal, which is why in the 1970s and the early 1980s, when these ideas start to get reintroduced, they're called neoliberal or new liberal. It's actually the old liberal, but a particular version of liberalism, which is kind of a reflection of New Deal Democrat policy that emerges in FDR's administration. We get this resurgence of these kind of classical liberal or almost libertarian kind of ideologies, which kind of picks up the label of neoliberalism. And one of the consequences, or one of the policy implications of this, is massive tax cuts to people at the very top. Corporations, we're going to slash corporate tax rates. For high-earning individuals, we're going to slash personal income tax rates and capital gains rates, and we're going to make it possible for people who have money to actually have even greater liquidity. And the idea was that these people would take their money, these rich people and these corporations would take their money, and they would then use it to start new businesses or expand existing businesses. And that the benefits of that sort of economic activity would trickle down, which is where you might have heard the term trickle-down economics, would trickle down to everybody else. And the argument is kind of summed up in the aphorism, a rising tide lifts all boats. The actual sort of formal term for this is what we call supply-side economics, right, which focuses on the idea of creating creating output through production, because you have the capital and the financial wherewithal to do so. But again, if you understand capitalism, and at this point in the class, I hope you understand capitalism, if there is no demand for those products, either because people don't want them, or is more likely the case, people can't afford to buy them because their wages are stagnant, their incomes are not going up as the price of things increases. In the absence of demand, capital is going to sit on its money. They're not going to spend money to create products and services for people who cannot or will not purchase them. But the net benefit of this is that rich people get richer and corporations get richer, and they hoard that money. They don't create economic opportunities for other people, because that's not how this game works. And of course, the state is heavily dependent on income that's generated in the capitalist economy. And as spending begins to decline in the 70s and the 80s, the state and the private sector have to get really, really creative in finding ways to stimulate economic activity. And of course, they do it in all the worst possible kinds of ways, like relaxing credit standards and letting anybody who can get a card and just purchase all all kinds of stuff, but basically do it through consumer debt. And so, by the time we get to the early 2000s, households are sort of swimming in debt. And debt service begins to take up a greater and greater share of the middle class's disposable income. So this is why this is a problem, right? If we have an ideology that says we have to do everything possible to prop up capitalist firms, rather than focusing government resources and policies in ways that prop up consumers, then you get a situation in which, as soon as consumers don't have the financial means to buy goods and services, the economy is at that point very, very fragile and very prone to sort of recessions and dramatic slowdowns. Give you some examples. I think that subsidies that we give to corporations and firms that are very, very wealthy, that are very, very profitable, are really good illustrations of this principle, of this idea that we all have to commit to supporting and subsidizing capitalist firms. In 2001, the city of Chicago offered $50 million to Boeing, right? Boeing is a major aerospace firm. Chicago offered $50 million in incentives for Boeing to move its headquarters from Seattle to Chicago. Not plane manufacturing, not the assembly plants, but just their headquarters. So they've got this very lovely building on the banks of the Chicago River in the West Loop. It's quite nice. It's also only got a relatively small number of Boeing employees in it compared to the rank and file employees who actually build the planes and the other aerospace technology that Boeing develops. That's all still being done in the Pacific Northwest and in other places. But that $50 million that Chicago spent to get Boeing to relocate its headquarters was $50 million then that couldn't go into the public school system. It couldn't go into helping maintain the CTA or the roads. It couldn't be used for any other kinds of socially necessary and really, really important spending in the city of Chicago, because we were giving $50 million worth of tax revenue to a company that is incredibly popular and profitable in 2001. Another example from 2001, this is in the wake of the attacks on 9/11. The economy kind of went into a pretty significant recession as air travel shut down, and as a number of other decisions that were made in response to the attacks kind of amplified some of the issues that had arisen in the economy earlier in the year. The U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate, along with the White House, created $15 billion worth of subsidies to the airline industry, right? So the airline industry was particularly hard hit after the 9/11 attacks. So the government, federal government, got together and said, we want to put together a package of $15 billion worth of subsidies to the airline industry. That's $15 billion of taxpayer, revenue that was generated and sent to Washington by people paying their income taxes. But the money didn't go to laid off workers. It didn't go to the allied tourism industries that people would travel to on these planes. It all just went straight to the airline industry, right? So the effect of those subsidies was to take money from the people who would do the traveling and the people who worked in the places that were being adversely impacted by a lack of travel, and give it to the companies that were in charge of the means through which people traveled. Again, sort of an example of taking money from the bottom and the middle and kind of pushing it up toward the top. Sort of an inverse of what a lot of people assume, which is that the government takes money from very, very rich people and channels it down to very, very poor people. But in fact, what happens is exactly the opposite. Another good example, a little older, but something that still occurs to this day. But from 1965 until 1992, the National Science Foundation, right? So this is national part of the U.S. government, the National Science Foundation, public universities, public foundations, right? So those organizations, the NSF, public foundations, and university-funded foundations, research that comes out of those organizations is responsible for 15 of the 21 most therapeutic drugs produced in this period. Again, 1965 to 1992. So NSF, public research, university funded research, National Science Foundation research. That research leads to the development of 15 of the 21 most therapeutic drugs in that period of time. But pharma, right, which is the pharmaceutical manufacture and research I suddenly forgot what pharma stands for. It's a lobbying agency for the pharmaceutical industry. Pharma claims that high drug prices are needed to recover research and development costs, right? So the actual funding that led to the development of these drugs comes from the public. It comes from you and me and everybody else who pays taxes, right? That's where that money comes from. They develop a whole bunch of therapeutic drugs, but the pharmaceutical companies hold the patents on those drugs, even though they're developed using public money. Private companies hold the patents, and they charge really high costs for these drugs, claiming that it's what allows them to recoup, I should say, the cost of producing those drugs, which they never paid in the first place, right? What pharma research mostly centers on is how to market those drugs, right? What color is it going to be? What are we going to call it? How do we sell it? What sorts of ailments can we sort of play up that can only be treated with these particular kind of therapeutic drugs? So again, we tolerate this. I don't mean you and I tolerate it. We as a society tolerate this because the idea is that if we don't let these companies charge these really, really high prices for these drugs, then we won't be able to develop new drugs. But again, the evidence is abundantly clear that it isn't pharmaceutical company spending that's developing these drugs. It's public spending. It's universities. It's private clinics that are working with NSF grants or other kinds of public funding that develop these drugs. It's why, if you look at the cost of insulin in even, just across the border in Canada, it's much, much lower than the cost of insulin in the United States. It doesn't cost more to produce insulin in the United States than it costs to produce it in Canada. It's just that in the United States, pharmaceutical companies are allowed to charge these really, really high rates. The government is very reluctant to step in and sort of put a cap on what you can spend, or what you can charge, I should say, for insulin. And so, people who get these life-saving drugs, right? Because if you're a diabetic, an insulin-dependent diabetic, this is literally the difference between life and death. And people will pay it. So that's another instance in which we can see government kind of favoring private corporations and firms. So that's the demand constraint. And again, we can just keep going on and on and on. Because there are many, many different examples. I want to very briefly talk about the resource constraint. I think this one's a little bit more straightforward. The resource constraint is a systemic imperative in which the subordination of the interests of most people get subordinated to the interest of capitalists. So now we're talking about people. Before we were talking about the general welfare versus the welfare of firms. Now we're talking about the interests of people versus the interests of capitalists specifically. And the reason why we call this the resource constraint is because some people have greater resources than other people. So because people have differential access to resources like money, or wealth or time or information, those who have a greater amount of those things are able to exert more influence over the way the system operates than people who don't. A really, really good example of this is low voter turnout among poor and working class people versus wealthy people. Um, right, most of you have probably voted. If you haven't, you will probably be voting in your first election very soon. It takes time, right? You have to get up, you have to go to the polling place, you have to stand in line. Usually it's, especially if it's a primary election, and we're doing primaries in February or March. As you know, in the Chicago area, it's quite cold. A lot of people don't have the time to be away from work. A lot of people don't have the time to be away from families so that they can cast a ballot. And so they just sort of say, I don't have time between 7 in the morning and 7 in the evening to go and vote. Whereas somebody who has the kind of job that allows them some flexibility, maybe you can take a personal day, maybe you have access to daycare, maybe you've got all of these things that your financial resources provide you with, and you go and you can take your time and you can vote. Efforts to sort of create a more inclusive, accessible democracy often center on things like expanding early voting, expanding mail-in voting, increasing the number of polling places so people don't have to travel as far to get to where they would cast their vote. And those efforts are actively resisted by the very people who understand that greater participation in democracy means that they are unlikely to prevail in these electoral contests. Or information, right? Some people are very reluctant to cast a ballot on an issue or for a politician if they don't know very much about the issue or the politician. And not surprisingly, people who have more money often have greater access to more accurate and better information. So they're more likely to be inclined to act on that information. So you got all kinds of different reasons tied to resources in which more affluent people, wealthier people, are able to express their interests more consistently and with greater persistence than people who don't have those resources. People who have a lot of money are much more likely to be able to get in direct contact with their representatives in state, local, and national government than people who don't, right? So if you need to reach out to your congressperson is very busy and they're probably not going to take your call. But if you are, say, a local business owner and you have, 400 or 500 employees and you make a lot of money and you write big checks for political campaigns and you host fundraising dinners where other people come and write checks for then politicians will take your call. Then politicians will listen to you. And then your agenda, your issues, your items are much more likely to show up in the form of legislation than the concerns of sort of rank and file people who don't have the ability to kind of reach out and have an impact on their politicians that way. So the resource constraint has to do with the fact that some people have greater resources than others, and as a result, those with greater resources are more likely to be able to promote a particular political or electoral agenda than those who don't. And again, it ties to voter apathy. It ties to an overwhelming sense sometimes of hopelessness among voters, that it really doesn't matter, that at the end of the day, the people who have money, the people who have power are always going to get their way, so why bother participating? And again, the knock-on effect is that we become less democratic because people drop out of the system. People stop participating. because they reason that it won't really make any difference anyway. All right, so that's the resource constraint. Those two, the resource and demand constraint, are the systemic imperatives that operate in the context of U.S. government. There are other systemic imperatives, and there are other things that impact the operation of U.S. governance, and we're going to talk about all of that in subsequent videos, but I wanted to make sure that you guys had a pretty good oversight of all of this, so I hope that makes it clear, and so until next time, I'll say take care.